This is the BBC.
How we laughed when she said it. Not exactly profound, is it, we sneered. But the significance of Theresa May's most memorable Brexit soundbite became all too clear this week. Brexit means Brexit, she said. And what she really meant was, look, you know that I voted Remain. You know that the vote was very close. You know the country wasn't really told, let alone really considered the complications. But we are really leaving the EU. And the reason she felt she had to say it all those months ago became very clear this week when a new powerful coalition took to the stage, arguing that Brexit didn't have to mean quite Brexit. Or at least if it did, we'd still be very, very close to the EU, in the single market, in the customs union, or even having a second referendum. My guest on the podcast is lining up to try to stop them. He's the man formerly known as a harmless, charming, eccentric backbencher, who reveals the first time he met a Prime Minister.
I met Ted Heath when I was about 3, just under, when he was Prime Minister. And so, yes.
Do you remember what he said to you?
I remember that he gave me Garibaldi biscuits.
That is the Mogg, of course, Jacob Rees Mogg. I say formerly regarded as harmless and eccentric because he is now regarded by friends and foe alike as the leader of a formidable hard Brexit faction and a potential future leader. And he's reacting very strongly to the EU's tough new negotiating stance on the Irish border.
The draft legal text from the Commission is very concerning because it's not something that democratic unionists can go along with, and that means that if the government agreed to it, the government would actually fall. And so they're proposing something that would bring down the British government if it were accepted. And that seems to me quite an aggressive move for the EU to take.
More from the Mogg, much more, a little later. Now, the first to take to the Brexit battlefield this week was the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, a man who at times has looked like someone who wants to talk about anything but leaving the European Union. Many of his allies have long believed that Labour's great strength is constructive ambiguity on the EU. Put another way, let the Tories stew in their own juice. Don't do anything to threaten the Corbyn coalition of North and South, working and middle class, young and old, Leaver and Remainer. Say nothing that might make them think that you're not on their side. So why did he come out and back membership of a customs union now? In part to head off the pressure from his own backbenchers and from Keir Starmer as well. One of his allies told me, we're damned if we'll be led in our Brexit policy by Keir. Jeremy will set out our position. Another reason is because of a motion tabled by the Tory Remainer Anna Soubry, last week's podcast guest, backing that customs union. Together they have the potential to defeat the government, and the whiff of a possible election was in Mr Corbyn's nostrils as he spoke this week.
We've long argued that a customs union is a viable option for the final deal. So Labour would seek to negotiate a new, comprehensive UK-EU customs union to ensure there are no tariffs with Europe and to help avoid any need whatsoever for a hard border in Northern Ireland. Labour would not countenance a deal that left Britain as a passive recipient of rules decided elsewhere by others that would mean ending up as a mere rule taker.
A sign of these remarkable times is how that speech from Jeremy Corbyn was welcomed by the Confederation of British Industry on a day they were attacked by the International Trade Secretary Liam Fox. His speech was overshadowed just a few hours before he delivered it by the words of his former permanent secretary, the senior mandarin at that department, a man called Sir Martin Donnelly. Quiet chap. I interviewed him on the Today programme and I read a speech he was due to deliver before he came on air. It took me 2 or 3 times to persuade him to deliver the juiciest soundbite.
Well, the challenge if we choose not to stay in the single market is, can we negotiate equal access in all those areas of services without agreeing to obey the same rules as everybody else. And I'm afraid I think that's not a negotiation. That's something for a fairy godmother. It's not going to happen.
But you also suggest this is rather like giving up dinner for a snack.
Well, yes, and that's an image of the fact that 3/5 of our trade is with Europe.
Forgive me, I don't want to taunt the listeners any longer. You know what the phrase is. Tell us what you say in your speech.
So the example I use is you're giving up a 3-course meal, which is the depth and intensity of our trade relationships across the European Union and partners now, for the promise of a packet of crisps in the future if we manage to do trade deals outside the European Union, which aren't going to compensate.
Now Sir Martin could be quickly dismissed by Boris Johnson as my former friend from the European Commission, one of the other side, in other words. Less easy to deal with, though, was the next to take to the stage, former Tory Prime Minister John Major.
It is already agreed that Parliament must pass legislation giving effect to the deal. A meaningful vote has been promised. This must be a decisive vote in which Parliament can accept or reject the final outcome, or send the negotiators back to seek improvements, or order a referendum so the public may approve what has been determined. That is what parliamentary sovereignty really means.
The strength of those words from Sir John Major, evidence once again of the truth of the old saw, what goes around comes around. Major has never forgiven today's Brexiteers, who in his day were anti-Maastricht Treaty rebels, the likes of Ian Duncan Smith and Bill Cash and Bernard Jenkin, for ruining his premiership, for damaging his reputation, and he's determined they won't win now. And as if that wasn't enough, up popped Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator, with a new negotiating line on the Irish border, which he must have known would have been completely unacceptable to the British government, because in effect it drew a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
Non, mais je suis pas. Je connais la.
I am familiar with the British political situation. I respect that political situation. We're not here to give lessons to anybody. We have complicated political situations in the 28 member states of the European Union. I'm not trying to provoke, I'm not trying to create any shockwaves. I want these negotiations to be a success, but it is my responsibility to recall that it is the UK which decided unilaterally to leave the EU on the basis of the outcome of a referendum, and the UK unilaterally, through a letter from Theresa May, initiated these negotiations in March. The UK established a date for leaving the Union 2 years after that letter. And we're 13 months off that date. 13 months.
Now, I'm no chum of Michel's or indeed a mind reader, so I don't know why he came up with something he must have known would be seen as unreasonable, but I've got a hunch. I wonder if he didn't think that the only way to really get the government's attention, the only way to force them to come up with something concrete, was to say, if you don't, I will. Almost as a plea to say, tell me something, anything we can really negotiate about.
It's also bad for you. You know, Brexit may be bad for Britain, it's bad for Europe. It's going to diminish Europe, it's going to weaken it. It's going to weaken it by taking out one of the major economies of Europe from the European Union, and it's going to weaken it politically.
Indeed.
Europe will be less influential in the world. So if it looks like Britain is prepared to change its mind, then if the price of that is Europe also putting forward changes and reforms which, by the way, would have widespread support across Europe, then that is something that Europe should do.
So
One former Prime Minister gives a speech the day after another former Prime Minister. Coincidence? Somehow. I doubt it. Tony Blair and John Major may have fought against each other in a general election. They may be in different parties, but on Northern Ireland, and on Europe, and on protecting their legacy, they're on the same side. One thing I'm very clear on is that inside Number 10, and indeed places like the Daily Mail, they are convinced there's a conspiracy to overturn the result of the referendum, and they're determined to stop it. And the bitterness that is growing on both sides stems from the fact this is not an argument over weeks or months or years. It's one that's been running for decades, ever since Harold Macmillan first tried to get Britain into the common market back in the 1960s. So the test for the latest big speech by Theresa May was, could she do anything to still the anger and to move the debate on?
We both need to face the fact that this is a negotiation and neither of us can have exactly what we want. But I am confident that we can reach agreement. We both want good access to each other's markets. We want competition between us to be fair and open. And we want reliable, transparent means of verifying we are meeting our commitments and resolving disputes.
Theresa May's Brexit speeches are always less about soaring rhetoric and much more about detailed negotiating manifestos. Every word, every phrase, every comma has been hammered out behind the scenes. They've been tested out against the warring factions in the cabinet. They've been sounded out with people in Brussels. They've been checked by officials in different government departments. Each has a meaning for what the British government intends to negotiate. But all that careful policy making, all that precise choice of language could count for nothing if in Brussels and the capitals of Europe their calculation is she'll never get it through the House of Commons. We're just going to wait for the other lot to defeat her instead. Let's hear now from our podcast guest, one of the people who'll be backing Theresa May, as well as trying to harden her position, is Jacob Rees Mogg, who now leads the European Research Group, bringing together more than 60 Tory MPs, hardline Brexiteers, who published a letter trying to stiffen Theresa May's backbone just a few weeks ago. I had a long conversation with him before the May speech about who he is and what shapes him and what really motivates him. And we couldn't do it face to face as he had to dash back to Somerset to avoid the snow. I began by reading him a quote from The Economist, which described him as the blue passport in human form, the red telephone box made flesh, the Royal Yacht Britannia in a pinstripe suit. Was he flattered?
Oh, enormous flattery and good fun, the sort of jolly part of politics where people think up enjoying epithets to throw at one, which have great charm to them. I quite like the idea of being the Royal Yacht in a pinstriped suit. And as it happens, I don't have a pinstriped suit, but as everyone says I do, perhaps I should get one.
Now what would you describe your suits as then?
They're mainly two-piece double-breasted suits of a single colour. They're not pinstriped. There's no pinstripe in sight.
Well, maybe this is one of a series of errors. You see, people always, when they describe you, they talk about the suit, don't they? They talk about the nanny, that's correct. They talk about the Bentley.
Oh, that's absolutely
and the
correct.
mansion that you live in. These are all correct, are they?
Yes, absolutely. I'm very proud of Nanny, who's been with my family now for 52 years and is bravely looking after my 6 children. And yes, I've got 2 elderly Bentleys, one made in 1936 and one in 1968, so 3.5-litre Derby Bentley is the 36 one, which is a very beautiful car. It's harder work to drive than a modern car, but it's fun to take out in the sunshine. And the 68 Bentley, which belonged to Gubby Allen, the former captain of England, who on the Bodyline tour refused to bowl Bodyline.
I ask you because people are intrigued about how Mogg became Mogg. In other words, how did the kind of eccentric backbencher, as some people saw you, become the man tipped to lead the Conservative Party? So let's go back to your upbringing. Your father. People of my generation remember him, distinguished editor of the Times, columnist for the Times then. Did that mean as a young child that you had a home full of the powerful, the well-connected, the wealthy?
Certainly we were a political household, and that my father knew a lot of politicians and political journalists who were visitors to the house. So as a child, I remember meeting people like Robin Day and Bernard Levin in the journalistic sphere, but also I met Ted Heath when I was about 3, just under, when he was Prime Minister. And so, yes.
Do you remember what he said to you?
I remember that he gave me Garibaldi biscuits. It was actually what had happened was my father was meeting him at Chequers, and my father couldn't drive, so we went as the family to pick him up. And Ted Heath invited us in to tea and gave me Garibaldi biscuits.
Did you like Garibaldi biscuits?
Yes, I've always liked Garibaldi.
Oh, so that's not to blame. I wondered if this was the deep-rooted explanation of your contempt for Europe.
No, not a bit, no.
And did other Prime Ministers come to call?
Well, my father was up at Oxford with Margaret Thatcher and knew her, but she never visited us as Prime Minister. She did visit us after she was Prime Minister. And so, no, my father moved in very, very political circles, and that was what I grew up with. And a lot of family conversation was inevitably political.
But some households, when the visitors come, it's, go off and play, children. Or in your case, it would be saying to the nanny, well, you take the children off to play. In others, they sort of perform. They're brought into the argument, the discussion. Were you encouraged as a young Rees Mogg to chat round the dining table about your views at a very tender age?
My father was always interested in everybody's views. It didn't matter on their age or their background. And as I'm sure you are as a journalist, that you're interested in what people think and what they've got to say. And that there may be some people in very high office who don't think very interesting things, and some people who aren't in high office who are absolutely fascinating. And that was very much my father's view. I mean, I don't know whether this is your view. I'd be interested to know.
Oh, absolutely.
If you do think like that.
No. One of the joys of this job, my job, is that you get to talk to everybody from prime ministers and presidents down to butchers, bakers and candlestick makers, and they're all as interesting. There are boring prime ministers and interesting candlestick makers.
Absolutely, and they've all got something to say, and it's worth hearing. And that was very much the background I grew up in. And so my father was interested in what his children had to say, which was very flattering of him.
But coming from that rarefied and unusual background, were you meeting bakers and butchers and candlestick makers? Yes, you've got these well-connected people, and people were interested in your views, but candidly, did you really ever get the chance to meet anybody who wasn't much like you?
Oh, well, inevitably, because we lived in a small village in Somerset, and so in village life, you know pretty much everybody who lives in the village, and people lead very different lives to the ones that we were leading.
What about self-knowledge? Was there a moment when quite young when you thought, I'm not really like a lot of other children? I mean, did you have a moment at school, albeit Eton, where somebody says, as David Cameron, he went to Eton, said he loved the Smiths. I'm just going to hazard a guess that you're not a big Smiths follower.
No, I'm not.
Do you have a favourite band?
No, when you said the Smiths, I wondered which particular Smith you were talking about, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or John Smith, or Samuel Smiths.
Or W.H.
Or W.H. Smith, yes. A very interesting man, W.H. Smith.
And TV shows, somebody might, at my age at school, I'm a bit older than you, might have said, we like, Porridge, or a little bit later, Only Fools and Horses. Did you ever?
I certainly enjoyed Porridge. I have very poor taste in television. I enjoyed Dallas and Dynasty when I was a schoolboy. And I sort of continue. I like watching not very high quality, not improving television. I've been watching Madam Secretary, which I don't know if you've even come across, but an American political drama on one of the more obscure Sky channels.
She's a sort of Hillary Clinton figure, isn't she?
Yeah, she is, yes. And of course, the world always works out perfectly with everything that she does, which is rather cheering in a way when things work. But to come back to your question, I think I'd answer it differently. I'd say what I became aware of wasn't that I was different, but that everybody is different, that everybody is individualistic and has their interests and makes choices that are not uniform or preordained. That doesn't mean to say that there may be some commonality of interests, that hundreds of people may want to go and watch cricket together, and that may be a shared interest. But all those people watching cricket will have a range of different interests that don't necessarily intersect. And I think that's at the heart, to come back to politics, of a conservative understanding of the world, that it's about thinking about the drawing together of a mass of individual views rather than a top-down view of society.
But the question that people often ask, and maybe underlies some of my questions, is do you really understand other people's lives? Brought up by a nanny in a mansion, went to Eton and Oxford, became a millionaire in the city, married to an heiress, 6 children now brought up by a nanny, and you've recently joked that you've never changed a nappy and never wanted to be a, quotes, modern man.
Well,
So
I certainly
can
never
you-
wanted to be a modern man. That was long before I had children. And the nappy thing, I was asked a question. I make the great mistake of tending to answer questions people ask me. It's not something I particularly want to discuss, the private affairs of my infants. But to come back to your question, the being in touch issue, I think depends on being able to empathise with individuals who you meet and who, particularly as an MP, come to see you to seek your help and advice. And that there is nobody who has an automatic understanding of other people. That we understand our own lives, but that we do not understand the lives led by sort of fate or by osmosis, the lives led by other people. There isn't this almost mystical understanding that some politicians claim to have. So that's the first part. The second part is you have to try to understand people. And so people come to see me in my constituency surgery, and they come with issues that arise in their lives where I may be able to help. And can I understand somebody who is facing a difficult problem in their life? Yes, of course I can. And can I then help them? Well, I will if I possibly can.
You said something very interesting the other day, which is to be British is one of the great blessings that you can have, perhaps the greatest on this planet. And there are lots of people who are very proud to be British who are not rich, but they might argue that that is the statement of complacency of someone who is privileged and is wealthy.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with you. I think the advantages of being British are the greatest if you're not particularly well off. That if you think of the National Health Service, we have a level of health provision in this country that is as good as anywhere in the world, that is available to everybody in the country regardless of their income or their assets. What good fortune is that? We have a functioning welfare system. That's not to say that it isn't without its issues, but that can ensure that people have a proper standard of living. We have an education system that ensures that everybody gets an education. And yes, I accept that some schools are better than others. We have, compared to many countries in the world, a very high basic standard of living. And the very rich can live wherever they like, and it doesn't make any difference to them. They can go off to Geneva or they can live in Shanghai. It doesn't matter.
I feel like I've suddenly started talking to Jeremy Corbyn. You've just said the NHS is great and the welfare state is great and state education is great, and you're a man who once described himself as in favour of full-blooded Toryism. That doesn't sound very full-blooded.
I am in favour of full-blooded Toryism. I recognise that there are things that the state cannot do, but of course I think that there should be a provision for people who are not able to provide for themselves. I think it's very important that we look after the disabled in our country. And
for example, many Conservatives of your persuasion would say the NHS is a kind of socialist model, that it would be better to allow people to take out their own insurance to do it.
But I'm a Democrat, and the British people want to have a health service that is free at the point of use, and that the public spending is lower than the United States slightly, and it's broadly in line with other European states. So however you cut it, I don't see that there would be huge savings in changing the NHS.
So people are very familiar with your views now on Brexit, and less so on the other things. Describe Moggtopia.
Moggtopia. If I remember rightly, utopia means, strictly speaking, no place rather than the perfect place. And I think that's the thing to remember, that there is no perfect place and that we live within the conditions in which we live, and that you have to try and improve things at the margins rather than thinking that you can build a new Jerusalem. But what am I in favour of? What underpins everything I believe in is that ultimately individuals make better choices for themselves and for their families than clever people in Whitehall can for them, and that the job of government and politicians is to try and take obstacles out of people's way in the lives they choose to lead, not trying to persuade them to lead lives that you think are good for them. So I'm a bit suspicious of nudge theory, not because it doesn't work, but because I don't actually think it's the job of the government to nudge us to do this, that, or the next thing. I think we should make decisions for ourselves, which will probably be better decisions.
You've even opposed things like smoking bans, haven't you? I mean, would you call yourself a libertarian?
I wouldn't call myself a libertarian because I think it's a word that has unfortunate connotations. I think that you want to allow adults to make choices for themselves as far as possible. Should all the regulations on smoking go? The answer is no. It's just a question of where you draw the line. The discouragement of smoking is something I think is a good thing, but I wouldn't bring in onerous bans and I wouldn't make it illegal, for example.
You said you were flattered by that Economist description, the blue passport in human form and the royal yacht in pinstripe suit. Would you call yourself a traditionalist? Is there something that you want to get back that we have lost?
I think the art of conservatism is to change what needs to be changed and to hold on to what doesn't need to be changed. I think getting back things that have been lost is usually an entirely fruitless exercise, that events move on and political life changes, and trying to reinstitute old practices tends to appear to be faintly ridiculous. So to bring back hereditary peers would now be a ridiculous thing to do, and there's no question of it happening.
And despite your profound faith, your Catholicism, and you've been clear that you didn't approve of gay marriage as a sacrament and you don't approve of abortion in any circumstances, but despite that, you're saying don't go backwards, they're done, or is there a chance to revisit them?
Society shows no sign of changing its mind, and these decisions are made by society at large, not by individual members of Parliament. So I don't see them being reversed. But
that's followership, not leadership, isn't it, as Mrs. Thatcher used to say. If you say to me, I like the NHS because the public likes it, and I'll stick with gay marriage because the public wants it, and I'll stick with wearing seatbelts or because it's already happened, that's not saying I, Rees Mogg, believe these things. That's saying, oh, well, lost that one, move on.
Well, actually, I do believe in the NHS. I think it is as efficient a way of spending public money and providing the health benefits that we need as a country and ensuring that it is available to everybody, which I think a civilised and wealthy nation wishes to do. So the NHS, I think, is something that I support more actively rather than simply saying, oh, well, it's there, so I'll keep it. And likewise, there has to be education and welfare. That is part of a civilised society. How you do it, the details are different, and I hugely admired Michael Gove's education reforms and likewise Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reforms. But to come to your point, politicians have to be realistic. What can they change? And there's no point in changing things where society has a settled view and it's not going to change it. So what do I want to change? Well, I want to change our relationship with the European Union completely. I want us to be out of it. I want us to have a more capitalist approach to economics because I think it will make everybody in society, particularly the poor, better off. So that means genuine free trade, opening up our markets. But these are the battles of today, not should compulsory seatbelts be around.
You say, my big focus is Brexit now and getting out. But the truth is, if you go back a few years, getting out of the EU was no more fashionable than legislating in favour of gay marriage. It took people to battle and argue, we interviewed Daniel Hannan on this podcast, for their whole adult lives to make it happen. And the thing I think some people want to know is, why? What is it about Brexit, of all the issues that you could focus on, excites you, energises you, makes you think above all the other things you could spend all that energy and charisma and parliamentary time doing? Why this?
Because it's about democracy. That it's about, can your vote change your government? Does your government have the power to change the laws when it's elected? And in the European Union, the powers of the government were limited in wide areas. That's what underpins everything that I believe about Brexit. But it also ties in with my view that I was saying earlier, that individuals, in deciding for themselves and for their families how society should be built and operated, are the ones who are likely to make the best decisions. And they make those at a national level. They don't make them at a European level because there isn't any proper European democracy. And there's very unlikely to be any in the foreseeable future.
Well, that's a principle. What, though, again, imagine I'm someone who's just still says, I don't quite get this. What's this all about? When you woke up last year, the year before, and thought, Brexit, that's what it's about. What infuriated you? What had to change? Not just a principle. What practical thing could Britain not do, could you as a politician not achieve because of our membership?
Well, the government couldn't even change the VAT rate on tampons. You know, the government was so hamstrung that it could not change the tax rate on a product that is essential and reasonable for millions of women in this country to want to buy. And you think you can't even do that because some bureaucrat in Brussels says you're not allowed to.
You're not saying to me that this great cause of your adult life is motivated by a few p off a sanitary towel.
You wanted one example as to why it was so ridiculous. I had another example, a farmer who came to me who had been very badly treated, and the answer I eventually got, trying to seek, as MPs do, redress of grievance for him, was that there was nothing the government could do because, even though they were sympathetic to his case, if they did anything about it, the government would be fined by the European Union.
Yeah,
so you can't have redress of grievance, you can't change the law, and your vote doesn't matter. That seems to me pretty serious reason for wanting to be out of the European Union. And then you can always say, oh, well, the individual examples, they don't really matter. We can mock them. But it's not that. It's that these are individual examples of things that are happening or continue to happen whilst we're still members across the country day by day. You can't get redress of grievance.
It offends you, doesn't it? I mean, this lack of democracy offends you. You once called it Brexit removing a carbuncle from the British Constitution, a perfect and beautiful system, you called it. What intrigues me is that this is less pragmatic than some of your other views, which are about there's some things in favour and some things against. I didn't ask you about making money when you were young, which you did, and it's always said you were a very cautious, evidence-based investor. This sounds to me much more like your faith. This is an act of faith.
Well, if you could say believing in democracy is an act of faith, but I happen to think that democracy leads to the best government.
Now, we're chatting before the Prime Minister gives her big speech. Just a few principles, though. You were pretty sceptical about the negotiating tactics a few months ago. Do you think we're reaching a point where it's time to prepare the public for the possibility, to warn Brussels that we are, as a nation, prepared to walk away without a deal?
I mean, I believe in good manners in public debate as far as possible, and I think we should stay at the negotiating table because that's the obligation we've got under Article 50. But the European Union needs to be very careful, and I do have doubts about the negotiating tactic. I think it was a mistake to agree the money first because the money is our strongest card, and the reason we're paying the money is for the rest of the agreement. It's not because we're nice, generous chaps and we'd like to give the EU a cheque for 35 to 40 billion pounds. But the legal text, the draft legal text from the Commission, is very concerning because it's not something that democratic unionists can go along with. And that means that if the government agreed to it, the government would actually fall. And so they're proposing something that would bring down the British government if it were accepted. And that seems to me quite an aggressive move for the EU to take.
Are they doing it knowingly, deliberately?
They're pretty clever people, aren't they?
And do you think they are, as some do, operating in cahoots with the Blairs and the Majors and the former mandarins like Martin Donnelly? Do you sense a concerted campaign to overturn the referendum?
I dislike conspiracy theories. Most conspiracy theories are wrong, aren't they? The moon landing took place and all of that. And so I think one's got to be really careful about conspiracy theories. I think I'd put it differently. I'd say there are a lot of people who have a genuine belief that leaving the European Union is a mistake and that they are going to campaign as hard as they can to frustrate that. And Tony Blair and John Major fall into that category, as do some of the people in Brussels. And so their interests are aligned, even if they're not working together. They don't need to be working together. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy for them to hold these views and to be perfectly entitled to put them. On the other side, we have to put our views and have to carry on winning the argument.
How would the country react if the 17-odd million who voted for leave felt it was either being frustrated or reversed?
Well, I think it would be very difficult if it were reversed. I think it's right to say you may know the precise number, that 3 million people who don't normally vote voted in the referendum. If you were to say to them, well, you were right not normally to vote because we're not going to take any notice of you anyway, that's a real hammer blow to confidence in democracy. And I know the EU's done this before. They've done it to Denmark and they've done it to Ireland, and they like to make people vote until they give the right answer. But I think there would be very deep-seated opposition to that in this country.
Deep-seated opposition or trouble? Your former leader, William Hague, said there'd be trouble on the streets.
And Lord Hague is a very moderate, carefully spoken man. I would take what he says seriously, but that's not what I'm personally predicting. I think, by and large, the British people don't take to the streets. Dare I say, we're not French. But it would be very serious and very troubling. And if William Hague says that, people should take it very seriously, but it's not a forecast I would like to make.
You're sounding very measured and laid back. It seems to me there has been the most powerful pushback against Brexit in this week. Be punchy. What's the message?
Who's been giving this pushback?
Blair, Major, Martin Donnelly, senior former civil servant, Barnier.
I'd say on Blair and Major that they're fine leaders of the past in their way, and that they don't have the influence or resonance that they think they might have. That
this is what you talked about a second about good manners in public debate.
Yeah, well, this is my view. I hope I'm not being unduly rude about them. But
I think you're being unduly polite. You once described John Major as having the bitter ramblings of a vengeful man who ought to know better.
Did I say that? Yes.
You did.
Well, I'm glad you've quoted that. I won't deny it.
You've not always got good manners, have you?
Well, John Major had attacked Boris Johnson in very personal terms, and I think if people pretend they're statesmen and then lower themselves in that way, they perhaps remove themselves from the Queensberry rules.
In your guide to good manners, is there anything you're not supposed to say? Anything that's off limits when you feel strongly about an issue?
I think one's entitled to debate matters robustly.
Traitors? Is that okay?
But I haven't used that terminology.
Wreckers?
I don't think I've used that terminology
Mutineers?
either. On the members of the Conservative Party who have voted against the government, I think they're completely entitled to. Bear in mind, I voted against the government in previous incarnations of government policy. I think MPs are not there to be slaves to the whip. They're there to make their minds up and vote according to their manifesto commitments and to their conscience.
I only ask you because, as you probably know, you, as well as having lots of supporters and lots of people who enjoy listening to you, you wind a few people up. Matthew Parris said your opinions are poison. Rees Mogg is quite simply an unfailing, unbending, unrelenting reactionary. Matthew Norman said hidden underneath the Savile Row three-piece suit, now we know it wasn't three-piece.
Only two pieces. I'm so sorry.
A deceitful, forgive me, I've just better let you hear this, Laura's a deceitful bully. So, in a sense, why? What is it about you that, as well as being charming people and amusing them, what is it that winds these people up?
You'll have to ask them, really, but Matthew Parris takes me more seriously than I take myself and has built me up into a figure that I'm not, which is all very flattering, and it often happens this way. It's fair in political debate that if they want to say these things, that's up to them. I believe in the freedom of the press, even when that means people are saying disobliging things about me.
I asked you about the paradox, because we had Jess Phillips on this podcast the other day, who's saying, Jess Phillips, of course, in the Labour Party, saying how much she liked you and enjoyed your company, and you've even become a pen friend with her dad.
Yes, he wrote to me, but Jess is a model politician, in my view. She is so deeply concerned for her constituents. She does everything she can. This may be indiscreet of me to tell you this, but she was hovering outside the government lobby in a vote a few weeks ago to collar the Home Secretary to get something done for one of her constituents. She is that type of Member of Parliament, absolutely devoted to her constituents' interest. And she's a very kind person. And I think there is room for people in politics like that and to have cross-party friendships. I mean, we disagree on almost everything politically.
She said she'd burn down the Commons if you came close to the dispatch box.
Well, there are, you see. But she is a very principled and good politician.
Isn't it the old saw, though, that says the enemy in politics is behind me in the House of Commons, not opposite? So you can call her principled, you've called Jeremy Corbyn principled, but John Major, oh no, he's not principled, he's vengeful.
Well, I don't think John Major is principled. I think he made his whole career out of not being principled, and is why he was such an unsuccessful Prime Minister. I make very few comments of this kind, but John Major crops up every so often pretending to be statesmanlike, trying to lob hand grenades into the government. And if you look at his speech yesterday, he says sort of things like, "I don't wish to cause any trouble." It was obviously untrue. He wanted to cause as much trouble as possible. That's why he made the speech. And I don't see why people tell these not quite strictly true things.
I was waiting. Is that a sort of the good manners and courtesy of a man trying not to say the word lie?
Well, the word lie is usually wrong, actually. Very few politicians directly lie in truth, and therefore it's a word that one ought to avoid.
He was maybe being, what was the phrase, economical with the truth?
Terminologically inexact is the Churchill phrase.
You praised Jeremy Corbyn for being principled. The other day, the Times said you were the Tories, Jeremy Corbyn. Did you regard that as flattery?
Oh, I thought it was very funny. It was Rachel Sylvester's piece, and I thought it made for a very engaging argument. Do I think it's accurate? I think you can always draw comparisons between people, but that we have a very different view of the world. And I would dispute that my views are the same now as they were 30 years ago, partly because 30 years ago I was only 18, whereas Jeremy Corbyn was by then a grown-up politician. And my views have certainly changed and weathered over the time.
I think it was because people think that a few years ago your views, certainly under David Cameron, would have been regarded as too extreme. Indeed, he did try to block you becoming a candidate, didn't he?
Well, certainly Central Office did, yes.
But as a serious point, and this is not meant to be pejorative, this is a real question. In the way that no one thought the Labour Party was ready for Jeremy Corbyn, is the Conservative Party ready for an anti-EU, anti-gay rights, anti-abortion, climate change sceptic, red in tooth and claw Thatcherite who wants to cut taxes and cut welfare? Is that what the Tory Party needs, if that's a fair description?
I hope blue in tooth and claw rather than red in tooth and claw. But I think Brexit is now going to happen. It's a process that is underway. Do we need economic reform to help us become more prosperous as we leave the European Union? Yes, of course we do. It opens up all sorts of economic opportunities that weren't currently there. Welfare cutting is, I think, the wrong way of putting it. I think the really powerful effect of the universal credit is ensuring that work pays.
I think the short answer to my long question, to be fair, is sort of yes. The country and the party might be ready for that set of views.
I think there are a lot of people in the Conservative Party who have similar views to me. I think you should put my moral views to one side. They are not the mainstream of British politics or of the Conservative Party. And I don't think that anybody putting those views forward would carry a majority in the country.
In other words, they should be seen as part of your faith and not part of your political programme.
Well, all these issues are free vote issues, and I think that's really important that they should be, not because I don't believe what I say, but because what would the situation be if you had somebody who had different views from me having a whipped vote on euthanasia, for example? And so I think it's absolutely right that these things are a matter for people's conscience and that will remain such rather than being part of a party programme.
Can you separate somebody's core values, though? Sincerely held, religiously founded, can you really separate them from understanding what generally motivates them in politics?
You can separate the law from people's personal beliefs. But what underpins everything, I think, is the value of every individual and the equal value of every individual, be that from the point of conception to the end of life. And the crucial thing there is that runs through what I think about welfare, what I think about the health service, what I think about taxation, that it is of crucial importance so that you remember that there are individuals who have to deal with these systems, and all these individuals are equally important. And it doesn't matter race, creed, any of those things, disability, any of those things. They are valuable individuals who the government must try and look after as far as it can. They are not categories of people. They are individuals, and therefore they are of value. And so, yes, there is a consistency, but I don't wish to change the law to enforce my moral views on people. But it would be absurd to pretend that my Catholicism doesn't influence my view of the world.
We began by talking about your upbringing and things you heard and things you did. Now, some stories are apocryphal. It was always said that you had gone canvassing in a Bentley and it turned out to be a Mercedes, even though your nanny had been in it. Is this apocryphal? That you once said, I'll be a millionaire by 20, a multimillionaire by 40, and the Prime Minister by 70?
I think out of the mouths of babes and sucklings sometimes comes some very silly comments. I think that was an interview when I was about 10 or 11.
Sometimes truth comes out of the mouths of babes.
Yes, on this occasion it was, just sort of thing children say.
Well, you've done the first two, haven't you? You've done the millionaire and the multimillionaire. There's only one to go.
You're more optimistic about my finances than I or my accountant are, but it's...
Well, you always refuse to answer questions on how much you're worth, but I think you've achieved the first two, as I understand it, millionaire and multimillionaire.
You're very flattering. We could talk about BBC salaries as you raised this matter.
We could, but we've just left this little gap, because you're not quite 50, are you? There's 1 years to go?
Yes, but that was a silly thing to say, and it was a fantasy of a child. I also wanted to play cricket for Somerset County Cricket, and so, children have these ideas which are not to be taken seriously in adult life.
I could get a lot more money betting on you becoming Prime Minister than I can on betting on you playing cricket for Somerset, I think.
That's it. Well, the odds on that are completely absurd. I am not a minister, never have been a minister, and the party of government always chooses a minister. I don't believe there's any occasion when a party of government has not chosen a minister. So if anyone has put money on, I would go down to the bookmaker and try and lay it off onto somebody else.
Wait till the Tories are in opposition. You can become leader then, because you don't.
We're not going to be in opposition. We're going to win election after election under the great leadership of the current Prime Minister.
I merely noted what wasn't said as well as what was said. Now, I better leave you to get out the galoshes and the snow shovel.
Well, there's been a little bit of snow whilst we've been talking, little sort of flurries. There's a bit coming down now, and I'm looking out at the children's swings blowing gently in the breeze with sort of about half an inch of snow on them.
Now, I know you don't change nappies, but will you have a snowball fight or make a snowman?
Well, if the children can get down from London, I think snowmen will be absolutely on the cards. And I have a nasty feeling that I will be target practice for my children, who will think it's frightfully funny to get a snowball winging in my direction. And I'm too wet to retaliate. I wouldn't throw a snowball at a 10-year-old or younger. It seems a bit mean.
Jacob Rees Mogg, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure, thank you. Bye.
Did you hear what I heard? A man not ruling out an ambition to be Prime Minister. And after all, he's got a lot of years to go until he's 70. His short-term chances will depend on how the current PM does, and in part what his verdict is on that Brexit speech. So I called him back in snowy Somerset and managed to interrupt another of his favourite programmes.
Hello.
Jacob.
Hello, can you hear Thomas the Tank Engine in the background?
I can't. Are you playing with him at the moment?
No, it's on the telly, and I'm with Alfred, and he'll probably be most put out if I turn it off.
Well, look, I don't want to detain you, but you've just been listening to the Prime Minister. What did you make of it?
I thought it was a good and very statesmanlike speech from the Prime Minister that is very reassuring to Eurosceptics. It's very clear in what the Prime Minister intends to do.
Why is it reassuring?
It's reassuring because it's a clear rejection of what the EU has been demanding, that the UK should stay in a customs union, or that there should be one for Northern Ireland to try and split up the country and destabilise the government. It re-emphasises the point that we will be out of the European Court of Justice jurisdiction in all areas, that we'll be free to set up our own trade deals, but that we want to do a friendly free trade agreement with the rest of the European Union.
And she said that she would not threaten to walk away, which Nigel Farage has interpreted as meaning that she's ruled out a no deal.
I don't think that's right. As she said clearly, no deal is better than a bad deal. So not walking away is a reiteration of her good manners, that we have a treaty obligation to try and negotiate an exit under Article 50. The Prime Minister intends to fulfil that.
So points out of 10, finally?
I mean, I think it's a good and statesmanlike speech. Inevitably, from a Eurosceptic point of view, there will be some compromises, but I think it gets a good high score.
Jacob Rees Mogg, thank you, and I'll let you go back to Thomas the Tank Engine.
Thank you very much. That's very kind.
That's all from Political Thinking this week. Remember, there are lots of back episodes you can listen to if you go to the website or look on your podcast provider. And it's always great if you rate or review it, but the best way for people to hear about it is word of mouth. You can use Twitter, you can use Instagram or Facebook, or you could actually speak to somebody if you like. The editor was Faisal Farouk, the producer Peter Snowden. Just one last thing to note. It's been a long time coming, much longer than the Tories said it would. But this was the week we stopped having a budget deficit.
This is the BBC.